Next, let's begin our discussions of program development, and we'll start with what's known as a requirements statement. When you're building an actual application in industry, you're typically going to have some sort of requirements statement that is going to describe what needs to be done, and then from that we would then begin developing an algorithm to solve that problem. So here we have a requirements statement. I took the one from the book and broke it into its individual pieces. We're working with a class of 10 students who took a quiz, and we've been given all of their grades, which are integers in the range 0 to 100, and if you look here and count these up, you'll see that we have 10 integer grades in this particular problem statement or requirement statement. So our goal here is to determine the class average on the quiz. So the next step after studying a requirement statement like this, and granted this is a relatively simple one, is to try to come up with the algorithm for solving this problem. Now, in order to figure out the class average for 10 students, we need to somehow calculate the total of these 10 grades, and then we're going to need to calculate the average, which is going to be the total of those grades divided by the total number of grades, and that'll of course give us the average. And then finally we're going to need to display the result. So this is the basic task that we wish to perform in this example. Now, this is kind of a high-level overview of what we feel we need to do to solve this problem. Let's take a look at some pseudocode that describes this in a more step-by-step approach. Now, if I have a bunch of grades, one of the things that I can do is stick those into a list and then walk through that list one at a time and calculate the sum of all the grades so far, or the total of all the grades so far. And in order to do that, we need a variable in which we can store that total. So you can see here that we've listed a statement that says set total to 0. And by the way, this is the final pseudocode for this particular problem. In the next example, we'll take a look at developing pseudocode from scratch. So we're going to have some sort of variable that's initially set to 0, because once we start walking our way through the list of grades, we would like to be able to take each individual grade and add its value to the current total, and eventually that will give us the sum of all 10 grades. Now, we also need to keep track of how many grades there are so that we can calculate the class average. So we're also going to have some sort of grade counter, which we are going to initialize to 0 and add 1 to that counter every time we process another grade. In this example, we could get away without that because we know based on the problem statement or the requirement statement that there were exactly 10 grades. However, we chose to write this in a little bit more general manner so that if we had fewer or more grades, we'll be able to still calculate the class average correctly. We are going to have a list of grades called grades that will contain the 10 grades in the problem statement in this solved problem. However, when you're an instructor, you may have classes of different sizes, so ideally you might want to have maybe a file containing the grades and read those into the program, as we can demonstrate how to do when we get to the file processing chapter 9, or you might input them dynamically from the instructor so that you can read in those values and process whatever number of values the instructor types, and we'll demonstrate a separate problem that does just that after this one. Alright, so we're going to work with a list of the hard-coded, explicitly specified 10 grades from the problem statement. Then we're going to walk through all those grades, and for each of the grades in that grades list, we're going to take the current grade and add it to the total, and we're going to add 1 to our grade counter. So when we get to the first grade, we'll add it to the total, which is currently 0, and then we'll add 1 to the grade counter. Then we'll go back to the top of the loop and we'll do it again for the second grade, and the grade counter will get added, incremented to 2, and we'll do it for the third grade, and the grade counter will get incremented to 3, and this will continue until we've walked our way through all 10 grades. Once that loop terminates, we will then go and set the class average by taking the total and dividing it by the number of grades, and finally we can then display that class average as well. So in the next video, we'll take a look at the solution to this particular problem. And one thing I encourage you to do is have your book open, and as you look at the source code that implements the solution or the algorithm for solving this problem as required by the requirements statement, look at the individual statements in the Python program and compare them one by one to these pseudocode statements. And what you're going to find is that on a one-for-one basis, we were able to take every one of these lines of code and turn them into a corresponding Python statement. And I should have said these lines of pseudocode, not actual code.